Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the Festival Director. FODI is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival based in Sydney, Australia, that aims to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. FODI gathers the world's best experts, innovative thinkers and mischief makers to provoke and inspire curious minds. Writer and podcaster Coleman Hughes says we're too focused on race and we're using it to appease our guilt. He instead has a vision for a future where individuals are judged by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin. But this is a very different view from what modern anti-racist movements like Black Lives Matter propose. In this live 2024 FODI edition of Uncomfortable Conversations with Josh Szeps, Hughes argues for a society that embraces a colourblind ethos to dismantle divisive narratives and foster a more inclusive culture.
Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Coleman Hughes. Thanks for coming. I'm Josh Szeps. I have a little podcast called Uncomfortable Conversations, of which this conversation will be an episode, so you can subscribe and hear it back as many times as you want on repeat. You can also get it on the YouTube page. Huge thanks to the festival for facilitating this, for allowing us to do it. To Cecily and Beck and Danielle, they've all been amazing, and this has been such a blast to be part of. And thanks to all of you for coming. We acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose lands we are sitting. Coleman, have you been struck by the fact that every event does an acknowledgement of country? Because anyone over the age of about 30 grew up in a country where that was not the norm. It now is.
Anyone from outside of Australia is still living in a country where that's not the norm. It's hard not to notice. I think if an alien anthropologist came to Earth to learn about Homo sapiens, visited all four corners of the Earth, and then went back to Mars to report to the secret civilization there, they would find something very interesting, which is they would find that all groups of people have done terrible things in the past. We are all trailing a history of brutality, war, colonialism. We often talk about those things as somehow a European phenomenon, a Western phenomenon. I think that's just the most recent example. It's the example that is taught most in school. Obviously, the biggest empire, the biggest contiguous empire was Genghis Khan's. There was slavery in Africa, Africans enslaving one another. 14 million African slaves brought to the Middle East in the Arab slave trade. Empire enslavement, it's not an exception to the rule, it is the rule throughout history. And that alien anthropologist would go back to his civilization and say, these humans, they've done terrible things to each other. Every time a new technology gets created, they use it to oppress each other, and whoever has the most power at a particular moment seems to lord it over the rest, and there's been so much brutality. But there's only one group of people that actually feels guilt for what their ancestors did. And it's the descendants of Europeans. For instance, I was at dinner once with friends of mine from Ghana, and as many of you will know, the dirty secret about the African slave trade is that they were already slaves when Europeans got there. They were sold, enslaved by other African tribes in raids and so forth, and sold for goods by Africans who profited off of the slave trade. So I asked my friend from Ghana, when you grew up in Ghana, how did you learn about this in school? Did you learn about it as something that you should feel guilty for today? And I'll never forget what she said to me. She looked at me like I was crazy, and she said, no, it's just a neutral fact for us. And I thought to myself, that is about the attitude that most human beings have towards the sins of their ancestors, except for the one
Well,
group.
you're making a descriptive claim there, but is that a normative claim? I mean, couldn't you just say, well, the Ghanaians aren't as enlightened as we are. At some point, they'll get the memo that was bad, and they should probably feel guilty about it.
Yeah, and then their whole society will improve, and they'll all benefit as a result, right? It's that last link in the chain that I severely doubt. I think we should all speak reverently and with great respect and understanding about the atrocities that have been committed in the past, whether in our own country or in another country. I think it's imperative to speak about it with respect, to not speak about it flippantly, to learn about it, to have museums dedicated to remembering it. All of that is to the good, but there is the danger of a bottomless pit of guilt and apologetics that never ends. And every time it seems like it's going to end, there's a new thing, right? There's a new thing that must be done, a new apology that must be made. And we have to be very aware of that dynamic. I'll give an example from the American context, because I'm very wary of coming to somebody's country and judging the way they do
Especially
things.
as an American. We all love that when Americans come and tell us how we should be living.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to speak in the American context, there are many demands for reparations for slavery, for instance, for acknowledgments, for apologies. And what strikes me as so strange is that people demand apologies for slavery not realizing that they've already happened, actually not knowing, okay? One time I was talking to a journalist, and I laid out to her why I oppose reparations for slavery, and she was writing an article in a major magazine. And at the end of the conversation, after trying to get me to budge in any way, shape, or form, she said, well, Coleman, would you at least support some kind of documentary, some kind of event that the whole nation tuned in to watch about slavery? And I said, well, absolutely, but isn't that what Roots was? She had never heard of Roots.
Explain Roots.
Presumably,
What was Roots?
many in the audience haven't. So Roots was one of the most popular television programs in American history in the 1970s. More people watched the finale of Roots than watched the Super Bowl that year. And it was a story about an African man named Kunta Kinte, who was violently stolen from his home in West Africa, made a slave in America, and eventually made to submit after attempts to escape. And he's the hero of the story. And the story is about the brutality of slavery, right? In 1970, and it was the most popular thing on television. And now I had a journalist telling me in 2020, well, wouldn't you at least support doing something like this for once? And she had never heard of it. And the moral of the story I'm trying to tell is that there is a kind of amnesia about everything that has been done, and the demands renew themselves, and we're on a kind of cycle. A kind of cycle of folly. I mean, in America, both houses of Congress have issued national apologies for slavery, and as some of you will know, students of American history, slavery was a state-specific issue. You know, a dozen different states have issued official apologies for slavery, and people still demand it as if it's never happened. So, what is this if not but between people, if you do something wrong to me and I ask for an apology and you give me one, and it's sincere, and I accept it, that's the end of the issue, right? But there is something far more toxic happening where the ability to continue demanding the apology is worth more than actually getting the apology.
But the ability to continue demanding the apology is predicated on the continued existence of discrimination. That's the theory, that there is still massive inequality in income, in wealth. There are income disparities. There's, no matter what metric you look at almost, whether you're talking about Indigenous Australians or you're talking about Black Americans, there's a disparity there. So the insistence on kind of, repeating the request, the demand for the apology is like we're floundering around here and we don't know what else exactly to do, or that you will allow us to do.
How does the demand for the apology address the modern day systematic?
Well, it presumably is not a demand for an apology in isolation, right? It's presumably along with.
No,
a bunch
often
of
it
other.
is. I mean, so this is a very interesting question, because there is a sharp divide between symbolic issues and bread and butter kitchen table issues. Symbolic issues are the national apology, the land acknowledgement, and so forth. This is, and I don't mean to dismiss them by saying symbolic issues, because symbols are important, but these are fully different from the issue of, are people going to a decent public school that is well funded? Do you grow up in a neighborhood that where you have to dodge bullets walking down the street.
Of course, but I think there would be very few people who would be.
By the way, solving the latter issue cannot be predicated on the former issue. In other words,
right, but no one's arguing for the former issue in isolation. No one's arguing for the symbolism without action. Also, I mean, presumably, presumably the theory, as generously as I can articulate it, would be it's no skin off anyone's nose to raise awareness about the injustice, about the historical treatment of these communities. Therefore, you're likelier to get the kind of buy-in that you need to get to the bread and butter stuff if everybody is on board with the symbolic stuff.
I think it's precisely the opposite. I think that if you go up to a typical American and you say to that person, I'd like you to pay more taxes because there's someone on the other side of the tracks who comes from a fatherless home, crime in their community, public schools, the water fountains don't work at the public schools. I think you'll get a lot of buy-in by saying, absolutely, I'll pay more taxes to solve that problem. And then if you then say, and also, I'd like you to acknowledge that you benefit from the history of slavery that person's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, and that moral stain is somehow inherited by you, I think right then you've lost them. And you didn't need the second thing to ask for the first thing, because why should it be predicated, why should a decent standard of living and be predicated on whether or not someone's ancestors experienced trauma in the country, right? Simply being a citizen enough has to be the entry card into a decent standard of living. And it does not serve the general, the long-term well-being of a multiracial, multi-ethnic society to try to relitigate sins that none of us individually participated in. And the reason I talked about the example of my friends from Ghana in the beginning is because the attitude that I'm not to be held responsible for things I had nothing to do with, that is a very deeply ingrained thing in human nature. The one exception, which is essentially liberal Westerners, liberal members of European offshoot societies, is struggles against the much more powerful urge in human nature to say, what does that have to do with me? Let's talk about things that are happening today and what we can do about them. And so I think it's always a seductive temptation and a threatening one to go too far on the cycle of demands for apologies and kind of faux forgiveness that never actually resolves the relationship as a true apology and forgiveness would.
Okay, let's grant then, for the sake of argument, that symbolism is useless and we shouldn't be doing welcomes to country, and talk about the bread and butter stuff then.
I'm not necessarily saying you shouldn't do it. What I'm saying is, if you're do it or don't do it, but you can't have it both ways, right? You can't be the most affected by guilt of any group of Homo sapiens to ever exist, and then also say that you're terrible. Because in fact, the opposite is true. My point is that offshoot societies of Western Europe care more about the sins of their ancestors than any other group of Homo sapiens ever. And we all have sins that, in theory, could be cared about. Right? So you can't have it both ways. You can't call yourself terrible people and do the welcomes to country, because the fact you care so much care so much more than any group of humans has ever cared is proof that you aren't, that the hearts are in the right place. So, what I'm really saying is do it or don't. It's not for me to decide, that's for you to decide. But understand what it says about you that you do it, and don't be bullied by the next person that comes along and says you should do it for twice as long.
Right, but
because it will come.
But didn't somebody have to say something equally audacious in order to get us to do it in the first place?
Sure, but what is it actually? My point is not that. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, take the United States, where this is not the norm, but like doing a land acknowledgement, as they're called in the States, would still be looked at the way that acknowledgements of country might have been here 20 years ago, where it's like, oh, here we go again. Here's some kind of tokenistic virtue signaling person doing this thing to make them look good, right? If you're going to normalize it, what you're saying is that the normalization of this in Australia is a credit to our country and makes us more moral than other civilizations have been. Therefore, isn't that an argument for doing it?
It's not quite what I'm saying. It's not quite what I'm saying. Here's what I'm saying, because it's a nuanced point. I am for, to the extent that something becomes an important tradition and an important symbol, I'm for keeping it. What I'm arguing is that there is going to be a next time that someone says, well, we'll really reach nirvana as a country if we do it for twice as long. And there may even be policy demands. I mean, we'll really reach nirvana as a country and cure our guilt for the sins of our ancestors if we do this thing. And that thing might be a bad idea. And when that day comes, you ought to have the spine to say no. And I'm not just speaking in the Australian context. I'm really speaking about America. I'm speaking about Europe. I'm speaking about all the places on Earth that have this rare temptation towards ancestral guilt to begin with. I'm not saying you roll back all the symbols you already have that are already traditions. I'm not saying you tear down the museum. I think what's done is done. The symbols that are there, and they're valid, and they're traditions at this point, and I respect that. But that doesn't mean you must go endlessly in that direction. You get the difference?
I get what you're saying. And to pivot it back to the American context, which is the audience for whom you wrote your book, it's quite clear that you don't just think that this is unnecessary, that the symbolism is merely window dressing. You actually think it is counterproductive, in the sense that, one of the things that you point out is that opinion polls have shown that over the past decade, the number of Americans who respond to the question, how are race relations going in America, has dramatically turned negative. I mean, people are much, much more pessimistic about race relations now than they were 10 years ago. You say that your peers sound more pessimistic about race relations than your grandparents do, who grew up in the segregated South. So what's happening?
So you're exactly right. If you go back to 2013, Gallup asks Americans every year of all race, how are race relations going? And a majority of all races said good or somewhat good, including a majority of Black Americans, Hispanic Americans. Then in 2013, it starts to take a total nosedive. So by 2021 or so, about half the people who thought it was race relations were good would say the same. The question is, what happened? As always, partisans of each side like to blame the other. So Republicans like to blame Obama. That explanation makes no sense, because it should have started in 2008. Democrats like to blame Trump. Again, doesn't make sense, started years before he got in office. The real story, I think, is that around 2013 is when everyone and their mothers had an iPhone and was on Facebook. And this fundamentally changed the way information spreads, what got into your brain, and what narratives you believed as a result. So in the American context, we have a country with more guns than people. We have a country with lots of gun crimes and so many illegal guns that even if we got rid of the legal ones, we would still have a gun homicide problem unlike any other similar nation on Earth. And so, a cop is shot roughly every day in America, and cops are quite paranoid about being shot. I think this is one thing many non-Americans don't really realize about why American cops seem so trigger happy relative to, say, cops in the UK. It's because actually a lot of criminals do have a gun in the glove compartment, and a cop gets shot every day in those kind of situations. What happened before 2013 is if a cop shot someone in a small town in in an altercation, in an arrest, a journalist would come, get a comment from the cop, get a comment from the family. Maybe you would see it on the 6 o'clock local news at most. Maybe it would make the state newspaper at most the next day. What happened in 2013 is that if that same thing happened, somebody probably whipped out their iPhone halfway through, probably missed the first half of the interaction, and therefore everything that comes after is out of context, uploads it to Facebook where it gets millions of views before a journalist has had an opportunity to give it the proper factual context. And what happened is, because that's how people got their information, people began believing this narrative that it was open season on the cops killing unarmed black people. In reality, your odds of being killed as an unarmed black person in America, at the height of concern about the issue, 2020, if you want to put it there, or earlier, was roughly your odds of getting hit by lightning, okay? That was the factual reality.
Just to throw another stat in there, because I was just leafing through your book before we came on and saw it again. I think you say that a majority of of Americans who describe themselves as very liberal, meaning very progressive, very left-wing, when asked to estimate how many unarmed black people are killed by police in a year, estimated over 1,000.
Yes.
And the real number is 12.
Yes, the real number for that year was 12. And the reason I included that fact in my book is because a lot of people make the argument that probably some people are thinking it right now. Okay, so social media showed us all of these examples of cops killing unarmed black people, but isn't that a good thing? I mean, don't we want to know about it? Aren't we being more informed and educated and learning about things that were swept under the rug prior to social media? Well, if it were true that social media was making us smarter and more accurate about the world, then you would expect in the age of post-social media that people would have an accurate estimate of the scope of the problem, right? And yet in 2020, when that poll was conducted, people overestimated the problem by 2 zeros, okay? So social media is not educating us, it's miseducating us.
That goes to the question of police violence and, you know, the 2020 riots and George Floyd and the pushback against that. But there's something deeper that you're criticizing in your book, which you call neo-racism, which is a whole way of thinking about race, essentially, which is a dominant kind of elite social justice, university-educated way of thinking that has shifted a lot. And I mean, I'm sure a lot of people here have kind of just felt it or smelt it since they were kids. When I grew up, the standard position on the left was don't pay any attention to anybody's race, don't be racist, that's the worst thing that you could be, just treat another person's skin color like it was their hair color or like it was their eye color, you know, just treat everybody absolutely equally and try not to pay any attention to people's race. That now is regarded as naive at best and sort of white supremacist at worst, because it dishonors both the intergenerational trauma, the historical marginalization of certain communities, the respect and reverence that we're supposed to have for the lived experience of people who come from backgrounds that are not ours, and so on. How would you articulate the current mainstream understanding of race in America?
As you said, I grew up in a liberal town outside of New York, a very racially diverse town. I had friends of every race, and I didn't think of them as belonging to a race. I thought of them by their first names and their qualities, and that was, those were the values of the people around me for the most part. Not to say there was not the occasional racist, but they were exceptions that proved the rule. When I got to Columbia University in 2015, I encountered a very different philosophy about race. It was a philosophy that said that I, as a black person, was by definition a victim of systemic racism, and that in some deep way, a non-black person could never really understand me and what I've been through. And in orientation at college, we did an exercise where we were asked for each person to go to a corner of the room based on their race. Now, I'm black and Hispanic, so immediately had to choose between those, which is, I think, not altogether healthy. But once that was over, I encountered a new discomfort, which was I felt it was being foisted upon me that I'm a victim, right? We were all taught to go in a corner and think about how you have either participated in or suffered from systemic racism. And I thought to myself, I actually feel rather lucky to have been born upper middle class, frankly, like most of the other black kids at Columbia, half of whom are really have more of an immigrant experience or from places like Nigeria and so forth. I don't think I'm a victim of systemic racism, absolutely not. But that's being foisted upon me. Moreover, we're being made to think of all of one another who we haven't even met yet, really. We're in the process of meeting other human beings for the first time, and we're being asked to see each other first as members of a race rather than as individuals, before we have even gotten to know each other. And I thought something about this, the purpose of this is to sensitize us to racial issues and so forth. The effect of it is to actually alienate us from one another. Its intentions were in the right place. Its effects were precisely counter to its intentions, I think. And there were so many instances like that in a place like Columbia. And all of this, it may sound like Greek to people that haven't been in a space that obeys this particular religion, and that's kind of what it is. It's a new religion. So forgive me if I sound like I'm reporting from another planet, but it exists. It's overrepresented in elite institutions like the American Ivy League universities, corporate America, and so forth.
It certainly exists here in the academy, and it exists to some extent in the media. One of the things that you're most agitated about is ensuring that it doesn't guide public policy, and that when governments make rules about who's eligible for what, that doesn't cleave down racial lines. But it seems that it is doing that. I mean, both in the United States and also here, the delivery of COVID vaccines, which is one example that you cite, was cleaved along racial lines. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were, well, I mean, I was going to say justifiably, but you tell me if it's not justified. I mean, this is a cohort of people who statistically were particularly vulnerable. We know that they die at younger ages. We know that they suffer from higher rates of diabetes and so on. So they were put into a cohort where in the delivery of the vaccine, in terms of who gets it first, there were old people and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of any age, and then it would go down the list. Is that not appropriate?
So I'll stick to what I know, talk about the American context. And you can translate and apply whatever lesson you think is worthwhile to the Australian context. In America, at the beginning of the pandemic, black Americans died at a higher rate than white Americans. And all the usual suspects said, bam, there's systemic racism right there. And shouldn't we therefore prioritize African Americans in getting the vaccine? When the CDC, the American Center for Disease Control, went to recommend how the vaccine would be distributed, there was a panel that was choosing between two alternatives. They were choosing between so-called essential workers, which included everything from kind of waiters and even bank tellers and this sort of thing, baristas, and the category of elderly. They determined in their own analysis that prioritizing the elderly would save more lives total. More white lives, more black, more everything, more lives total. But the problem is that in America, the elderly as a class skew white, okay? The average black American is like 10 years younger than the average white American, so you can do that math. Average Hispanic is even younger. So they recommended that we instead prioritize essential workers because that's a more racially diverse population. Give it to them first rather than the elderly as a class because the elderly are too white. Knowing full well that this was a more deadly recommendation. Now, thank God that became public and there was so much backlash that it didn't end up happening for the most part, though every state had different policies and certain states did prioritize by race. But the fact that you could have the highest governing medical body in the country recommend such a thing, knowing that it was a more deadly option, shows you that this ideology of neo-racism has poisoned what would otherwise be any kind of rational, compassionate, sane policy. Okay, we had the same thing in America around making sure restaurants survived COVID. During during COVID, restaurants left and right were going out of business for obvious reasons. And the government allocated $28 billion to help save these restaurants. And, how did it do that, right? There are two ways that were proposed to go about it. One would be, restaurant, you tell me how much you're suffering this year as opposed to last year, and the ones that are suffering the most will help you guys first. Makes perfect sense. That's the logic of a hospital triage, right? Instead, what they did is they said, anyone who is not a white man, you are in the priority group. If you're a woman, if your restaurant's owned 51% by a woman, by a black person, Hispanic person, etc., or a veteran, they threw veterans in there, you will be helped first. White men who are not veterans, back of the line. There was backlash, needless to say. But by the time the policy was reversed by a judge who found it unconstitutional, and it was clearly unconstitutional, most of the money was already gone. So would it not have been better to simply allocate resources based on the financial need of the restaurants involved? And if black restaurants were hurting more, then black restaurants would end up getting help sooner, but not on the basis of being black, on the basis of an objective metric like how much you're hurting. So when I say that you have to be able to resist the demands of neo-racism when it comes to policy, this is what I mean. You have to be able to not be guilted into stupid policies because of a noble impulse. This is what I mean.
And just to give a last example, which I thought was fascinating in your book, the unions are now on board with this. Traditionally you would have expected that unions would defend workers, equally on the basis of their need as workers. But in many states in the United States, now there are either proposals or actual rules where unions think that they're doing the right social justice thing by changing the order of who gets laid off. For example, if a public teachers union, for example, the Department of Education needs to lay off teachers, traditionally it's done through some kind of hierarchy system. Now it's done according to who's not black.
Yeah, and this is Minnesota Teachers Union. In one of the new contracts, this is probably a year old or so, said instead of doing last hired, first fired in case of budget cuts, right? We're going to do last white person hired is the first fired in case of budget cuts. And the impulse behind all of these policies, the pretext for these policies is that we are redressing the history of discrimination. The effect is that you're creating a new kind of discrimination. Ultimately, the cycle of discrimination has to just end. Okay, it has to end at some point, and we have to make colorblind public policy the norm.
But what's wrong with saying that it should end when we have roughly equal distribution amongst the races?
Because in a multicultural society, you're never going to have statistically equal outcomes across the board. It's a contradiction in terms.
No, but it could be better than the vast disparities that we currently have.
So yeah, it could be, and the way to get there is to address it on the basis of class. Okay, is to say rather than jerry rig who gets fired once you're 25-year-old public teachers, jerry rig who gets fired according to race when the state cuts a budget. How about we look at the fact that from 0 to 18, a lot of the kids in those classrooms grow up in terrible conditions. How about let's focus on the time in life when you can actually have the most impact on people, which is to say 0 to 18. Okay, that's a conversation that's totally missed when it comes to neo-racism, right? People want to look at someone at 18 and say, okay, we're going to get rid of meritocracy completely, judge you according to race, and this is somehow going to balance the what is at bottom a huge human capital gap between the African American community and the white community, to say nothing of the Asian community in America. That is not a wise way to address the problem. The wiser way to address the problem is to say, let's do everything we can to address the human capital gap at its roots between the ages of 0 and 18, where we can really make a difference. And then once you're adult, we are absolutely going to judge people by a meritocratic yardstick, not according to their race. We're not going to reverse discriminate against people because that's the only way in the long run to have a fair multiracial society. The ethic here is that I agree to not discriminate against you on the condition that you agree to not discriminate against me. All it is the golden rule applied to the question of racial discrimination.
Right, but the sense is that the golden rule gets invoked the instant you have 400 years of oppression, and then the instant we get rid of Jim Crow laws, all of a sudden we go, great, are we good? Is that fine? Can we just be equal now? Well, no, maybe you need to balance the books a little bit because there's been so much imbalance in the past.
Okay, so is the logical endpoint of that argument is it should be 400 years of Jim Crow in the other direction. Okay, so when you actually take that argument to its conclusion, that argument sounds ridiculous. Okay, and we have to get to a place where we get rid of the fantasy that we are going to balance the scales of human history. It is, because that's what it is. It's a dangerous fantasy to think that the effects of slavery can somehow be undone. It can't be done. The tragedy, the reason these things are tragedies is because we can never give back the lives that were stolen from people. It can't be done, okay? That's true of every instance of slavery across the world. It's true of every instance of needless war. It's true of famine. It's true of genocide. It's true of all of these things. What you can do is, as I said in the beginning, you can speak about such things with reverence. You can teach them in schools. You can make sure people never forget by enshrining them in museums. And we have done all that and more when it comes to slavery in the American context. But what you can't do is use public policy today to undo or reverse the effects. That is a dangerous fantasy, and all it is a recipe for creating more resentful victims of discrimination in the present.
Let's talk about how we're getting on as a society and as a people in multicultural societies. And in about 5 minutes, we'll start taking some questions. If you start thinking about questions, we'll put up some microphones shortly, and you can come to the mics. If you work in a big company in Australia or the States now, you go through mandatory anti-racist training. You are sent. We've all clicked through those things that you have to click through to say, if is it okay to touch another person's hair if they're a person of color? Is it okay to call a female colleague toots or whatever it might be? And you go to no, that's a bad thing to do, and you sit there and you click through. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of inclusion training. There's a lot of quotas in the media to make sure that the media shows and programming are reaching a certain amount of diversity, both of race and also of sexuality and sex. There's a lot of conversation just more broadly about how we need to have a conversation about race. We need to get real about race. We need to have a reckoning. We need to, especially in this country, grapple with our history. We need to get real about it in a way that we supposedly haven't so far. And yet the first sentence of your book says you've always found race boring. You've written a book about it. You've flown halfway across the world to talk about it. Why write a book about it? And is it helpful for us to talk more or less about race?
It's not a topic I came to, it's a topic that came to me. And what I mean by that is, as a kid, I had absolutely no interest in the race of the person. That I like I said, I grew up in a very diverse place, friends of every race, didn't care about their race. It didn't occur to me to care about their race. But as I entered the elite, woke, social justice spaces, all of a sudden, people were labeling me a victim without my permission, right? So that's when race became interesting to me. I said, what is it about I'm sitting in Columbia University, the most progressive square mile you could possibly imagine, okay? There is not a white supremacist beyond in sight. I mean, I think they would bounce off the force field of the campus if they, okay? And yet, people in the campus newspaper are writing that they experience white supremacy every single day. That is when I became curious, because there was a mismatch between narrative and reality. And I was a college student, doing what college students do, drinking too much, running around campus, plenty of opportunities for me as a black man to have experienced this white supremacy that I was hearing about so often. And yet, all I encountered were basically just nice people that pretty much had the right instincts about anti-black racism.
So what's going on then when we're told, repeatedly that I walk through the world with a privilege, with a sort of a halo of naivety about me? And this is a claim that I have to give credence to, because epistemologically I can't put myself in the shoes of not being a white man. But that I walk through the world completely unaware of just how dripping with privilege my whiteness and my maleness is. Like, if that's not true, or if it's only a bit true, what's going on?
Okay, so it depends on the context. If you are a black kid, especially if you're a poor black kid and you walk into a deli, they might think you're stealing something, even if you're doing nothing at all. Okay, that's real, and that's not going to happen to Josh Szeps if he walks into a deli in Harlem. If that's white privilege, then yeah, I believe in white privilege. My problem with the way this gets talked about is that people are just so dishonest about the full landscape of privileges. So I have no problem with a person that just wants to be honest about the way people can be treated differently in certain contexts. But it's often the same people that complain about the proverbial black kid being trailed at the supermarket who's doing nothing wrong, who will then deny that black people experience any advantage from the college admissions process in America, right? When every study that's looked into it finds that to be black is to be given an extra 2 or 300 points, basically, or the equivalent on the SAT when you're applying to colleges. So I'm absolutely fine talking about real instances of racism. I think that that's healthy. I think it's a good thing to point out when there are real examples of racial discrimination against black people, against Hispanic people, in ways that white people may rarely experience. But let's also talk about the reverse. Let's be honest about everything. Let's talk about the fact that in America, many white people have been told, I'm sorry, you're a great employee. In any other case, you'd be the first I promoted, but we need to diversify. I'm getting a lot of pressure to diversify, and I need a Hispanic candidate for this role. But you're actually the best, I'm sorry. How many white people have been told that in America? Countless, okay? So that's an example of something you're not supposed to talk about in this so-called honest conversation about race. I feel that I am principled and open to talking about all of it. However, really the people that usually say, let's have an honest conversation about race, usually that's code for, sit down and shut up and let me tell you about how bad black people have it, which can only be one part of a truly open and honest conversation, right? You can't only air your grievances and expect the rest of the world to listen if you're not willing to listen to theirs.
I mean, the question of exactly how much we should be talking about it at all is also salient and is something you wrestle with in the book. You have an analogy about baseball, which I think is cute, which will completely go over the heads of us as Australians, not being baseball fans, but you could probably make the same analogy to cricket or rugby. What's the point? What's the point you're trying to make about whether or not we talk about race and focus on race, or try to turn the volume down on it?
So there's a famous interview of Morgan Freeman you may be familiar with, where I think it's Charlie Rose says, how are we gonna get past racism? And Morgan Freeman says, stop talking about it. And he says, I'm gonna stop calling you a white man, and I'm gonna ask you to stop calling me a black man. I'll call you Charlie, you call me Morgan. And what he's alluding to is the way that a kid like me grew up, right? The natural attitude of a child towards race is not to care about it. Children are born with many flaws. I think often they have to be taught to share. They have to be socialized in many ways. One flaw they are not born with is racism. They may notice color differences, but they don't care. What Morgan Freeman was getting at is we ought to capture that a little bit more. We ought to reinforce that a little bit more as adults. And my baseball analogy was that if I gave you a mission to reduce the hatred between two rival sports teams, I used New York and Boston, and you came up with a plan that said, we're going to constantly talk about sports as much as possible. We're going to use sports analogies in every math class starting from grade 1 onwards. We're going to make sure everyone is educated as to the history of sports. Do you think that would increase or decrease the rivalry between those two sports teams? Now, my point is that it would certainly probably increase it, because now people just care more about sports, so they're going to care more about the home team, right? And they're going to hate the away team more. My point is that if we emphasize how important race is from a young age and do, woke kindergarten, which is actually a real government-funded program in San Francisco, is that going to increase the amount of racism or decrease it? I would argue it's probably going to increase the amount of toxic racial hang-ups people have, because the more they care about their race and others, the more race will become a container for all of the bad aspects of human nature, from hatred to envy to simpler things like neuroticism and paranoia. So my view is that, yes, talk about real examples of racism. If you can point to me a system that is really racist, let's talk about that. Let's get rid of all of the toxic race-based obsession that has nothing to do with actually fighting real racism and just gets us all hung up and helps nobody.
Well, I'm glad to learn that San Francisco is literally just a conservative's cartoon version of what San Francisco is, if it has woke kindergarten. Let's take some questions if people want to come up there. If they have one, go for it, sir.
Hi, Coleman. You wrote about the voice and the vote. There was a lot of voice posters for voting yes, particularly even in the suburb. They're even still up. I just saw some outside. That referendum failed quite dismally. How do you explain, you've kind of talked about this silent majority aspect. How do you look to fix it? Is it a question of courage?
Yeah, so I won't talk too much about the voice, because I think you guys will know more about it than I do. But it does mirror a lot of phenomena in America where, for instance, we were blindsided by Trump's victory. Many people have been blindsided by the fact that affirmative action in America has lost many referendums, including in 2 referendums in California, which is a blue state and a very diverse state. And there is this phenomena where, because elite institutions, most mainstream media outlets outside of Fox News lean so far left that people who consume that as their news are often blindsided into thinking that everyone agrees with those views, or that if they disagree that they're alone. And I understand that, the voice referendum here from the polling I've seen began as quite a popular proposition and lost support over time.
Hi, Coleman.
Just on the substance of it rather than the polling of it.
As an American, I can't imagine having a feature of a state's constitution that acknowledges one race or ethnic group as having any different privilege than another. So that it would probably just be a non-starter in America, and again, it's one of the cases where, because it was a symbolic thing primarily, it was an advisory role, it was not an extra vote. If it had happened and it had gone through, it would be probably a tradition I respected in 10 or 20 years. But it's not, it was a symbolic issue, and it was a matter of preserving the principle that constitutions should not recognize race, and I very much understand why Australians voted that way.
Interesting. Thank you. Go for it.
Recently, Trump tried to get Kamala to pick whether she was Indian or black, and I guess, are you suggesting that voters should perhaps ignore that? And do you think Kamala will beat out Trump so we don't have to put up with him for another 18 years?
Yes, I think in general voters should ignore stupid things. Now, the reason Trump did this is you may recall we have a well-known senator, Elizabeth Warren, who is a serious contender. She claimed to be Native American early in her career, and many times, and Trump called her Pocahontas, ironically, probably one of his best political jokes ever, because when she tried to prove him wrong, prove that she was Native American, she did a DNA test that found that she was at most, 1% Native American. And by that standard, my 6% makes me practically a Native American chief. So Trump stupidly thought that he could repeat this successful tactic on Kamala, but the problem is Kamala's always been honest about being half black and half Indian. And so, he's trying the same tricks that have worked before, but it's not going to work in this case. As for the election, it's a total coin toss right now.
Thanks. Go for it.
Thanks, Coleman. Thanks, Josh. I guess these are all really nuanced, interesting points. I also feel like the average, everyday Australian, thinking about how we veer away from any conversations about the accountability regarding race, it's still so hard. The country nearly had a conniption when it came to the voice and the vote around that, talking about race. Do you think that everyday Australians are ready for these conversations without using them as an excuse of, I'm kind of off the hook, I'm doing an acknowledgement of country, I can take it and run that, I know that I'm trying to be better? I guess this is more so a question directed to you, Josh. Do you think we are ready, not just people in Redfern at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, but an average, everyday Australian listening to these points?
Ready for what, exactly?
Ready to take on these kinds of perspectives where it's a
like
really...
Coleman's, you mean?
Correct, yeah, and nuanced perspectives around race.
Yes, absolutely. I think I have faith in people generally. The success of my podcast, not to big note myself, gives me faith that there is a hunger out there for people to have bullshit-free conversations about important, provocative things without treading on quite so many eggshells and worrying about the tripwires that might get triggered. People are getting bored of the legacy media, the way that they're doing things. People are bored of going to an HR meeting on Zoom and there are 4 middle-aged white middle management women and they all start by doing a welcome to an acknowledgement of country, and you're like, why are we all masturbating each other with this? Let's do some real stuff for Indigenous Australians if we want to. Yes, let's listen to First Nations people, figure out what they want and work together. I think the tokenism is grating to people, so I think we are up for it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's why we're here. Go for it.
Thank you. Love the conversation. And actually, perhaps as a corollary to your point there, Coleman, as a bit of a macro question, in context of, say, the pendulum swing, so to speak, what's your sense at the moment, especially in America? Because I'm mindful we see so much through the news, which tends to report on the extremes, no matter which side it is. Do you feel like there is greater nuance? At what point do you get to stop talking about race?
Oh yeah.
And let's do rapid fire now because we're running out of time. But yeah, it's a good question.
I think with this issue, the peak, it peaked in its badness around 2020 and 21. It's been getting better in America in the past 3 years, but it's not as good as it was when I was a kid.
I'm just going to go really quickly. Diversity hires are based off the idea that because of current discrimination, it's aimed at giving marginalised people an opportunity. Do you disagree with them, and do you have an alternative?
Yeah, the alternative is colorblind hiring. If you really want to be smart about this, you blind yourself to the data. And there's tons of studies that show when you send out 2 identical resumes, there is quite a bit of discrimination, not just against black applicants, but against South Asian applicants, against East Asian applicants, and so forth. So to actually try to do everything in your power to actually blind yourself, I mean, the analogy is like an orchestral audition behind a veil. I mean, that should ultimately become the norm. And the strange thing is, in these studies, they find that black employers are no better. So it's actually not true that making an organization diverse inherently makes the organization less racially discriminatory. I think ultimately colorblindness is the best principle to shoot for. How you implement that in any given circumstance is going to be context dependent.
Thanks.
Thank you. Last question, go for it.
Hi, I have many questions, but I'm only going to ask one. Now, you were talking before earlier about your upbringing and being in the middle class and everything else. Don't you think that this affects the way you look at racism? If you didn't come from a middle class and from a diverse society or your neighborhood, whatever you live, where you come from, don't you think that would have perhaps affect your view on racism? Because you haven't experienced it, you're not any different to any white person next to you that never experienced that before.
Yeah. So it's about the 1,000th time I've got that question. It's funny
I never heard your book, so I'm sorry. I wasn't aware of you.
No, that's okay.
It's a good question.
I didn't expect it. I didn't expect you to be, rather. So, there are tons of people that come from nothing that have the same message I do. Glenn Lowry comes from the south side of Chicago. Thomas Sowell, the most famous, I don't consider myself conservative per se, but he's really a black conservative and comes from, Jim Crow South without running a house without hot water and, grew up in youth homeless shelters and stuff. And a lot of the most articulate purveyors of my ideas are people that come from nothing. Ultimately, I don't think that the truth depends on where I come from. I think that there is a world out there that is the way it is, and we have to try to describe that truth as accurately as possible, regardless of our background.
Yeah, I agree. Just one more question.
That's all we have time for. Thank you so much for coming. Buy Coleman Hughes' book. It's called The End of Race Politics. Subscribe to Uncomfortable Conversations. Thank you all.
This session was recorded live at Carriageworks Sydney in August 2024. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a not-for-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit ethics.org.au to find out more. Thank you.